The Denver Broncos might be the worst team in their division. The Cincinnati Bengals could be in real trouble. The San Francisco 49ers are probably better off with Jimmy G at quarterback, and I may have been wrong about Tua Tagovailoa. I'm going to get into all these takes in a Week 2 NFL roundup on this episode of Lots of Thoughts, a sports podcast. Without further ado, let's get into it. I want to first thank every single one of you for listening to this episode or watching if you're watching on YouTube. You can find us on socials on Instagram at Lots of Thoughts Sports, on TikTok at Lots of Thoughts Sports, on Twitter at LOT Sports Pod, on Facebook at Lots of Thoughts a Sports Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Lots of Thoughts, a sports podcast there. We have daily video content uploading to the channel, including podcast episodes. So if you're listening on an audio platform, the link to the YouTube is in the description, or you can visit our website, lotsofthoughts.godaddysite.com. There you can access the podcast, the newsletter, the YouTube, the Instagram, the Twitter, the TikTok, the Facebook, all from that one website. Oh, the new merch launched in Amazon, merch by Amazon, available on the website as well. That's lotsofthoughts.godaddysite.com. Please check it out. If you are watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button down below. You'll get daily YouTube notifications when we release a new video every day at noon Eastern time. Now to the NFL. I'm recording this late Sunday night. It's around 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the Packers-Bears game is going on. I saw it was just 24-7. Yes, halftime, 24-7. I'm going to assume that game is nearly over. Obviously, you never really know, but it's very much going the way I thought it would. So I'm going to just go through the week of games and what I thought about each one. I haven't had the chance to comment on last week's Monday Night Football debacle between the Seahawks and the Broncos. So I'm going to start there with perhaps my hottest take of the bunch. And this is a tweet I'm going to read, and I'll retweet it from the podcast Twitter account at LOT Sports Pod. But I retweeted it, or I originally tweeted it from my personal account. And I said, in this thread, it was a thread of NFL takes for this season before week 1, some of which were very hot. And I thought the hottest of the bunch, which I indicated on the Twitter thread, the hottest of the bunch was the AFC West has 3 playoff teams and the Broncos aren't one of them. And I thought that was hot because the Broncos had high expectations, not because I didn't think a lot of the Raiders or the Chargers, the Chiefs, but just that, the common opinion is that the Broncos could be a very, very good team. And I think we saw major issues with them in week 1 against the Seahawks, and we saw those issues resurface this week against the Texans. Now, they got the win this week, and they're 1-1. They're not the worst team in the division so far. The Raiders are 0-2. The Chargers are 1-1. And who else? Why am I blanking on the 4th team? And the Chiefs, of course, are 2-0. But I think the more pressing issue is that the Broncos, I don't think, are a very good football team. I think there's definitely a lot of parallels that are made between this iteration of the Russell Wilson-led Denver Broncos and the Peyton Manning-led version of the Denver Broncos, right? You had a team, in theory, with, back in, 2014 when they acquired Manning. He had just come off injury. The Colts wanted to move on. He was available, and the Colts really were intending on rebuilding after not having him for a full year and nearly going 0-16 that year. They might have gone 0-16, either 0-16 or 1-15. You get the point in drafting Andrew Luck first overall the following year. They wanted to move on from Peyton Manning. And rightfully so. Andrew Luck was a great prospect and ended up being a very good quarterback. And, their offensive line severely limited their production. So, maybe it wasn't the smartest decision. But Peyton Manning had gotten his use in Indy and had done very well for them. He was, basically the face of the franchise in the modern era. And they moved on to Andrew Luck. And hindsight is 2020. They should have maybe kept Peyton around because Luck's career didn't last as long as it could have. But of course, Luck retires early and they move on, and they haven't had any quarterback stability since. But back to the Broncos. The Peyton Manning-led Denver Broncos were a great situation for both sides because the Broncos were a win-now team. The Colts needed a lot of pieces, and that showed even when Luck got there. They were still not a great team. He could never stay healthy. He got hit a lot in the pocket because their offensive line was horrible. Whereas the Broncos had a very good team, a very good offensive line, very good weapons. Demaryius Thomas still in his prime there. and a great thriving defense, right? Akeem Talib and Von Miller and all these guys that were really tearing up the scene. They just needed someone to lead them. And Tim Tebow was that guy in the previous year, led them to a playoff win against the Pittsburgh Steelers. And at the time, it looked impressive. It looked like the Broncos could have a real shot to make a run in the near future. But football minds knew that Tim Tebow wasn't that great of an NFL quarterback. And this was kind of like a miracle run, not really something that was sustainable. So the next course of action was getting someone who's sustainable. The Peyton Manning sweepstakes started, right? It was between Tennessee, potentially, and Denver. And he ended up going to Denver. Smart choice for him. He ended up getting another ring out of it. But that team was made for a quarterback that was the finishing touch. And the Denver Broncos tried it again, right? They didn't have a solid starting NFL quarterback. They had Teddy Bridgewater, who was okay. They had Drew Lock, who was okay. They needed someone to really take them over the hump, or so they thought. And they thought Russell Wilson was that guy. The reason I think it's not similar, first of all, I think the wide receivers are a little bit worse than they had previously. Part of the issue of trading for Russell Wilson is that you had to give up Noah Fant, and that was one of their best weapons at the tight end position. They still have good wide receivers, right? But it's still not to the caliber that Peyton Manning had in Denver. Of course, he had Wes Welker there alongside Demaryius Thomas. He had a bevy of weapons there, and the offensive skill set is not as great in Denver. Their offensive line is probably a little worse as well. But their defense is notably worse. And the trade of Von Miller really is kind of curious looking back. If he was going to leave in the offseason, yeah, you trade him for the assets that you can get because he's going to walk. But we have no indication that he wanted to walk. He loved Denver, and they traded him in theory to rebuild going into the following year, get a better younger caliber quarterback. I should say younger, better caliber quarterback to lead them into the future. And they didn't do that. So Von Miller, after getting traded to the Rams and getting a ring, great for him to get another ring. He goes to Buffalo who ends up being the highest bidder. And I'm not really sure about the salary cap situation. I'm not sure if Denver could have matched that contract. But it seemed curious knowing that they went for a win now move to get Russell Wilson. And the defense as a whole doesn't look as good as it did when Peyton Manning was making his runs to the Super Bowl and eventually winning the Super Bowl. And then Russell Wilson's another factor of this. Peyton Manning was a risk, right? He was coming off of that neck injury. No one really knew what he was going to be when he came back. And he ended up being still that top flight quarterback, at least for a few years. And the last year, his arm strength significantly declined. And, they still ended up winning a championship. But you didn't really know what you were getting after that injury. That's a big injury for an NFL quarterback or any NFL player to have. And they were taking a risk by signing Peyton Manning. But Russell Wilson looked bad. I mean, the Seahawks were bad last year, yes, because of a lack of talent. But they were one of the worst teams in the NFL when he was healthy. And I talked to a Seahawks friend of mine who I watched the Jets game with today. We'll get into the Jets later on. And one comment he made is that Geno Smith looked better last year than Russell Wilson. And I fully agree. I didn't see as much Seahawks football as he did. Shout out Freddie if you're watching this video, or listening to the podcast. But I definitely also saw a similar pattern. Russell Wilson didn't look crisp last year, and you could have blamed that on a lack of weapons or Pete Carroll's lost a step. But as we've seen the Seahawks this year, they're not as bad as they were last year. And I know they got talent for Russell Wilson back, and they still have good wide receivers, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, et cetera, et cetera. They still have a decent amount of talent. Rashad Penny running the ball. Some defensive players that, aren't too great, but some that are still decent. I think Russell Wilson was worse than a lot of people thought he was last year. I think he's definitely taken a step down. You combine all that with Denver not being as good as the last time they made this attempt with Peyton Manning, and then you bring in a rookie head coach. And bless his heart, Nathaniel Hackett was completely outmatched by the moment on Monday Night Football. Outmatched. Why in the world, when you have a 50-second timer, you let it bleed down to 20 seconds to kick a 64-yard field goal instead of going for it on 4th and 5? That right there is grounds for a poor decision. The correct decision was to go for it, no matter who you are. That doesn't take into account the fact that your quarterback is Russell Wilson, one of the biggest names of this generation. That also doesn't take into account the fact that you just traded for the man and paid him however many millions of dollars guaranteed to be the guy. If for nothing else, you live and die by your quarterback because of the moves that you made in the offseason, and Nathaniel Hackett didn't. And not only that, but the next day he has the gall to come out and say that, he made a poor decision in the moment. I've seen a lot of people, especially in mainstream media, saying, if you're a player on his team, you like that he owned up to that decision. I don't. I really don't. An NFL head coach should not be afraid of the spotlight, should not be overwhelmed in the moment in week 1. That was a simple decision from the get-go. Nevertheless, the Russell Wilson layer, nevertheless, the trading for him and, adding on those guaranteed years of his contract. The fact is, the smart football decision, analytically or just in old school football knowledge, was to go for it on 4th and 5, and you didn't. You blew it. And him coming out the next day shows, and saying that he made a mistake, shows that he wasn't ready for that moment. And if you're not ready for that moment in week 1, if I'm on that team, I'm wondering if you're ready for that moment in week 17 or 18, or if you're ready for that moment in week 1 of the playoffs or in the Super Bowl when the lights are brighter, way brighter than they are in week 1. Are you ready to make that decision? Are you ready to trust in your quarterback? He is the guy you brought in to lead this franchise to the Super Bowl. That's why you brought Russell Wilson in. It wasn't to make a run at the playoffs. It wasn't to be a good team. It wasn't to gain relevance. It wasn't to sell tickets. It wasn't to sell merch. Maybe it was to do all that. But you brought him in to make a run at the Super Bowl. And week 1, you showed no faith in him. It was an all-time poor decision. I was sitting there watching the game wondering what the hell he was doing, and it hasn't aged any better despite his attempts to do so. Okay, that was a little bit of a rant. The Seahawks this week, I'll continue. I'm sorry, the Seahawks. The Broncos this week continued to not be impressive. Russell Wilson ended up with 14 of 31 for 219 yards and a touchdown. Underwhelming stats. He did have a decent touchdown out to Eric Saubert that I thought looked pretty good, but overall underwhelming considering their opponent was a team that many expect to be one of the worst 3 teams in the NFL. If this is a team with Super Bowl aspirations, which they should be, that was a depressing game for them. The other team in the division I wanted to talk about was the Raiders, because with my take of having the Broncos in last place, I don't think anyone's arguing with them being below the Chargers and the Chiefs. But I think the Raiders had an all-time collapse today, and I think that'll happen with a head coach who's not experienced, right? And I know I just laid into Nathaniel Hackett for being unexperienced, and technically Josh McDaniels has been a head coach before in this league. But that was a bad loss for the Raiders, for sure, to the Cardinals, who are a team that is struggling in their own right. But I believe in the Raiders' talent a lot more. I believe in Derek Carr. I believe in Josh Jacobs. I believe in Devontae Adams. I believe in Darren Waller. I believe in Hunter Renfrow a lot more than I believe in a lot of the Denver wide receivers, the Denver weapons, and the Denver quarterback, frankly. If you gave me one game to win today with a given roster and all I had to choose was Derek Carr versus Russell Wilson, I'd probably take Derek Carr. And one of my takes in that thread also was that Derek Carr would finish top 3 in MVP voting, unless there's a drastic change. I don't see that happening, but there could be. It's only week 2. But I still believe in the Raiders more than I believe in the Broncos overall. Call me crazy, but even though the Raiders are 0-2, I think they could be seeing a bounce back going into the next few weeks. Next up, the Cowboys and the Bengals. The Bengals are underwhelming. Call it a Super Bowl hangover. Call it Joe Burrow being in his own head, but they're 0-2. They lost to Cooper Rush and the Cowboys and Mitch Trubisky and the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 1. Joe Burrow looks not so great. He does look like he's in his own head, and I don't know if that's because of the hangover or if that's just him being, thinking too much. But they haven't looked great, and I think they really need to correct something if they want to make a run. I think this game spoke more loudly to the fact that the Bengals are not ready to compete at this moment, rather than the Cowboys being a good team, because they're not. But overall, kind of a not so interesting game in the slate today. Next on to the 49ers and the Seahawks. The 49ers didn't look great last week, and call it the weather, call it what you want. I don't think I've seen enough from Trey Lance to say he's the guy in San Francisco, even in the slightest. He has looked underwhelming, and I know he had a few flashy plays in the preseason, but I don't think that's enough to really say that you're ready for the moment, right? Chris Streveler, who was the Jets' fourth string quarterback, had a comeback victory drive in every single preseason game. That doesn't mean that he's a good NFL quarterback, and they didn't even roster him. Trey Lance had those moments in the preseason, but I'm not sure he's ready for them in the regular season. You never want to see a guy like that get injured. But I think they're better off with Jimmy Garoppolo, at least for the time being. I think eventually they have to Lance grow, and maybe that's without Jimmy behind them. Maybe Jimmy behind him kind of puts the pressure on a little too much. And with Jimmy Garoppolo's contract ending this year, perhaps he could be gone in the offseason and Lance could get a fair shot next year. But he's likely out for the season. It's really unfortunate that his injury happened, but the 49ers might be better off in the short term. And the Seahawks on the other side came crashing back down to earth. Geno Smith's always a quarterback that I thought could be good if he limited the turnovers and limited the plays where he made poor decisions. And he had one of those today that was a real backbreaker. He ended up 24 of 30 for 197 yards. Really, he's been efficient so far in these 2 weeks. And he was last year in the time that he took over for Russell Wilson when Wilson got hurt. But the mistake plays cannot be overcome for a team that's clearly lacking talent. Next up, we had the Rams and the Falcons. Falcons, despite being 0-2, have more talent than I gave them credit for. Drake London looks pretty good. Kyle Pitts doesn't. But Cordell Patterson's resurgence as a running back who I have really been impressed with just on his stick-to-itiveness, if you will. His ability to really completely change his career outlook by switching positions. Remember, he was an all-pro return man and deep threat wide receiver. And all of a sudden, he's bulked up quite a bit. Still looks weird seeing 84 run between the tackles, but he is a true upper echelon NFL running back. And Mariota has looked pretty good as well. I never thought he really got a fair shake in Tennessee. I don't think Tannehill is that great of an upgrade over him, but they made that decision and they may live to regret it. But he's looked somewhat impressive in Atlanta. He's made throws when he needs to, and he's quieted the noise that Desmond Ridder should have a chance to start. The Rams on the other side, they looked rough in week 1, but they come back and get a much needed victory. Jalen Ramsey had a big interception in this game. Cooper Kupp is Cooper Kupp, right? And I think Matthew Stafford would look significantly worse if he didn't have Cooper Kupp catching passes from him. Kupp ended up with 108 yards and 2 touchdowns today. Overall, a really quality game to watch, but only one of these teams is really going to be a threat as the season comes down to the end. Next up, the game of the week, the Dolphins and the Ravens. This was incredible. The Ravens were up 28-7 at half, really 35-14 at the end of the third quarter. And the Dolphins make this miraculous comeback. Tua Tagovailoa. I might have been wrong about him. One of the tweets in that same thread. This is a thread that's going to live on, whether in a positive or negative way, to definitely be something I'm looking at throughout the regular season. But I said in one of those tweets that Tua is going to disappoint them a lot, and it's going to remind them a lot of what Jimmy G has provided for the Niners the past few years, and just not being good enough to win the game for you. And he proved me wrong, at least today. 36 of 50 for 469 yards and 6 touchdowns, an incredible stat line. And that really overshadows Lamar's incredible performance. Lamar Jackson was everywhere, had a 70-yard breakout touchdown run. He was really incredible. But Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill look like an incredible wide receiver dynamic duo. The Dolphins could make some noise in the postseason this year. I think the Ravens are a really good team as well. But this was definitely the game of the week, and it was a fun watch. Now we go into the opposite end of the spectrum, the Jaguars and the Colts. Boy, the Colts are rough. I always thought Matt Ryan was wasting his time in Atlanta, and they should have traded him earlier. And maybe it was Matt Ryan, dare I say. When you see a previously good quarterback in a bad situation that ends up doing poorly and then gets traded, it's always a wonder whether it's the quarterback or whether it's the situation. And in this case, it might have been the quarterback. He doesn't look crisp. He's not really handling pressure well. And he's always been a guy that can't really escape the pocket all too well. And that hasn't been improving, to say the least, as he's gotten older. The Jaguars' big additions really looked good. James Robinson looked good. I know he wasn't an addition. That was kind of a weird sequence of wording, but he looked good. Ended up with 23 carries of 64 yards, 464 yards and a touchdown. And Christian Kirk looked good as well. Trevor Lawrence seems to be developing pretty well. He ended up with 25 and 30 for 235 yards and 2 touchdowns. You really see the culture change Doug Peterson brought there, and I think that's the big takeaway I came out with from this game. He's really changed the culture around from Urban Meyer, who granted had one of the worst cultures of an NFL team I've ever seen. So of course Doug Peterson can improve that, but he was a great hire. It reminds me a lot of Dusty Baker with the Houston Astros, right? The Astros had that cheating scandal. They got rid of Jim Crane, their GM, and AJ Hinch, their manager. And they brought in someone who had to change the culture, who had to be that lovable guy in the clubhouse, both from the inside and from the outside. And that's exactly what he did there. And Doug Peterson has kind of done the same thing in Jacksonville. He hasn't done it yet, right? He's just started the phase, but so far they look significantly better than they were last year. And they could be making strides to being a better team throughout the rest of this year. Next up, we had the Patriots and the Steelers, two teams that I really am not interested in watching whatsoever. Underwhelming quarterbacks, underwhelming talent on the roster. 17-14 was the final score with the Patriots winning this one. Overall, a dud of a game. I really don't want to talk about it. Mac Jones ended up with 21 of 35 for 252 and a touchdown. Nelson Aguilar had a nice grab in the back of the end zone, ended up with 110 and a touchdown. Just a boring game from two teams that I think are going to be in the hunt just because the AFC's, very top heavy, and they might sneak into that 7th seed, neither of which I'm going to be excited to watch in the playoffs. Next up, we have the Giants and the Panthers. The Baker Mayfield Panther area. The Baker Mayfield Panther era has not been a great one. And granted, it was kind of a last-ditch effort because they were going to go into the season with Sam Darnold as the starter, and they clearly don't believe in him despite giving him the 5th-year option last year. That was a big mistake. But I think this game speaks more to what the Giants are this year. The Giants were an inept team last year. You could see they had a little bit of talent, right? Daniel Jones showed flashes. Saquon could never stay on the field, but he was once a good running back. Kadarius Toney showed flashes. Kenny Golladay was a big price, guy that they brought in. Sterling Shepard showed that he had some juice. They had a lot of pieces that could develop and could turn out well, but poor coaching and absolutely awful asset management from GM Dave Gettleman led to their team being inept. And Joe Judge screwed himself over in the final week. I talked about that last week, taking quarterback sneaks right in front of their own end zone to eventually punt the ball. But the Giants seem to have gotten their GM and their head coach right. Brian Daboll has this team absolutely fired up. And that has made Saquon a better runner. That has made Daniel Jones a better quarterback. And they haven't asked Daniel Jones to do too much, albeit, but he's getting the ball to the playmakers. He's not making dumb decisions. He did make one last week, but this week he looked a lot better, a lot more crisp. And I think even if the Giants don't have their franchise quarterback in Daniel Jones, which I still don't think they do. I think they could do better in the draft if they end up being, near the top of the first round. I think they have to be excited. Giants fans have to be excited for the new regime built in New York. Next up, the Buccaneers and the Saints, a game that didn't really have a lot of spice until Mike Evans and Marshawn Lattimore went at each other. That was fun to watch. Ended up 20-10 with the Buccaneers taking the win. The Bucs look good. Brady looks good. I think they're the best team in the NFC if I had to pick one. Packers are definitely in contention. I'll talk about them in a second, but this game came down to Jameis Winston making mistakes when he really needed to not. I think he threw 3 interceptions today, if I remember correctly. I don't have his stats in front of me, although I could pull them up relatively quickly. Yes, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions, went 25 and 40 for 236. And that's Jameis Winston for you. He makes big mistakes, and this game they couldn't recover from them. I think the Bucs are the class of the NFC, and I think the Saints are still a step away from competing. And one of those big steps is the quarterback, because their wide receiver core is very good. Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, they have pieces there. Obviously, Alvin Kamara, they have pieces there that could make of a good team if they have a quarterback that can bring them to that next level. And I don't think they do. Next up, the Lions and the Commanders. Two teams that really surprised my expectations. The Lions did much better than I thought they would so far, and the Commanders did much worse. The Lions competed with a team like Philadelphia, who I think is a good team, and the Commanders underwhelmed against the Lions and barely beat the Jaguars last week. Carson Wentz ended up with 30 of 46 for 337 yards and 3 touchdowns as the Lions edged out the Commanders 36-27. The game wasn't really as close as the score lends it out to be. Hutchinson looked good. He had 3 sacks in the game. He was all over Carson Wentz, and their offensive line is suspect, and that doesn't help when you have a quarterback who is already, his stock is already at a low point for his career. He hasn't looked great necessarily, but he's looked good enough to win them games. It's just the rest of their team hasn't played up to that ability, which I think they have the potential to do. And the Lions have some talent, right? Jared Goff is not their franchise quarterback, their long-term solution, but he's not necessarily someone who you can just write off as one of the worst quarterbacks in the league. He's made a Super Bowl, and granted, Jimmy Garoppolo's made a Super Bowl too, but he is a capable starting NFL quarterback, and the talent around this team you could see is starting to build. It's really just developing. For the life of me, Jamison Williams, I was trying to think of when they get Jamison Williams back, now that they have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's really breaking out. He ended up with 116 yards through the air with 2 touchdowns today, as well as 2 carries for 68 yards. He looked really good. They're going to have a wide receiver core that's built for the future. They have a decent offensive line. They have a decent defense. I think when they get their quarterback, they could be one of those scary rebuilding teams. Next up, we had my favorite game of the week. The Jets beating the Browns 31-30. I still have my Jets shirt on. Joe Flacco made the plays when he needed to, and from someone who doubted him coming into this game, I was impressed. He went 26 of 44 for 307 and 4 touchdowns. Garrett Wilson looked like the bona fide first-round pick that he was. Ended up with 8 receptions for 102 and 2 touchdowns. He is an athletic specimen, crisp routes, jump balls. He's incredible. He makes guys miss. I'm excited for the potential of him in New York. But it was an all-time crumble by the Browns. They were up 13 points, ready to kick the extra point with, I forgot what the time was, 1:40, I want to say, left in the game. And, a few seconds later, they missed the extra point. They kick off a deep ball to Corey Davis, and all of a sudden, the Jets are within 1 score, and then their special teams unit cannot convert on the onside kick. The Jets get the ball back, and the Browns fans were shuddering, and the Jets drove down, and all of a sudden that extra point meant something because the Jets took the lead on the second Garrett Wilson touchdown of the afternoon. The Jets looked like they're making improvements, which is the first time I've seen that in the Robert Saleh era. And the Browns, they got to hope Deshaun Watson's the guy because they're still a step away with Jacoby Brissett from being a decent team, in my opinion. I don't know if Deshaun Watson elevates that, especially with nearly 2 years of missing football. It's been a long time since we've seen Deshaun Watson play, and it's only going to be longer. So who knows what he's going to look like when he comes back. He can't be any worse than, he could be worse than Brissett. I shouldn't say he can't be any worse because Brissett's a good backup a good NFL backup quarterback. But it'll be interesting to see, considering they've liquidated their wide receiver core. Amari Cooper looks like their only competent receiver. Of course, they've still got 2 dynamic running backs, and David Njoku looked good today. I think the Browns, albeit have aspirations to make a deep run in the playoffs, I don't think they're there yet. The Thursday game, the Chiefs and the Chargers, this was really the 2 heavyweights. Justin Herbert, unfortunately, got hurt. Still ended up with 33 of 48 for 334 and 3 touchdowns. That's a hard stat line to say, as the Chiefs beat the Chargers 27-24. Mike Williams looked good as the primary wide receiver. He ended up with 8 receptions, 113 yards, and a touchdown. I was thoroughly impressed with him. I still am not convinced Justin Herbert's that upper echelon quarterback yet. I think he definitely has the potential to be, but I think there's a level above where everyone else is at, and that level where Mahomes and Josh Allen and maybe Aaron Rodgers is at is not where Herbert's at yet. But with the talent around him, I think he could develop into that very soon. But the Chiefs are going to be hard to beat. I think they're still the class of the NFL. I think Buffalo's right there, and we'll see what they look like tomorrow night against the Titans. But I think the Chiefs are the team to beat in the AFC. Patrick Mahomes just makes everything look so easy, man. Travis Kelce had a good game, but Mahomes is the guy. And as long as he and Andy Reid are there, that team is going to be a good one, no matter what they have around them. And then the last game, the game that's currently going on, the Packers and the Bears. Bears just scored a field goal as we have, where's the timer on this? 5:16 left in the third quarter. Listen, the Bears won last week, and that was an impressive win. I'm not sure that they're making the improvements that maybe people thought out of week one. And the Packers, on the other hand, played poorly in week one against the Vikings and are having a bounce back victory. And they did the same thing last year. I think Aaron Rodgers kind of comes out a little slow to start the season. And hopefully this is not the case this year for him, but he usually ends the season slow as well, which is in his last playoff game. He tends to stumble. But the Packers are a good team, and Aaron Rodgers is a majority of that. Are they going to be one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the NFC? I think so, but I don't think that has been so far verified. I think we're still going to need to see 1 or 2 more weeks of them beating up on some teams that we don't necessarily expect them to beat up on before we can say that Aaron Rodgers is ready to lead his team to the Super Bowl. One of those predictions in the thread that I had on Twitter was that Aaron Rodgers was going to get the monkey off his back, win a few playoff games, but lose to the Chiefs in the Super Bowl 1 rematch. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'm going to stick by my prediction because it's still within a possible likelihood of outcomes, right? The Chiefs are a very good team. I just said they're the class of the AFC and the NFL. And I think the Packers are one of the top 3 or so teams in the NFC. So it could still happen. But I'd probably take the Bucs over them in the NFC. Either way, the Packers are a very good team, and I think the Bears still have to make major improvements before they're ready to make a run at a playoff spot. Well, that has been the rundown on week 2 of the NFL season. I hope you enjoyed this episode, my takes about each game. If you like the content, feel free to subscribe wherever you're listening, on any podcast platform or on the YouTube page, Lots of Thoughts, a sports podcast on YouTube. You can find us on other socials at Lots of Thoughts Sports on Twitter. I'm sorry, that's the only platform that's not Lots of Thoughts Sports. At Lots of Thoughts Sports on Instagram, at Lots of Thoughts Sports on TikTok, at LOT Sports Pod on Twitter. You can find us as Lots of Thoughts, a sports podcast on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever you want to find us. You can visit our website, lotsofthoughts.godaddysite.com. There you can access the podcast, the newsletter, all those platforms, the merchandise, everything on that website, lotsofthoughts.godaddysite.com. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening or watching this episode, and have a wonderful rest of your day.